A stolen diamond, a murder, and a clue hidden in plain sight. But can anyone unravel the twisted secrets before it's too late? Stay tuned till the end. This mystery will have you questioning everything. In the solitude of his comfortable London apartment, Hercule Poirot sat by the fire, a rare moment of peace in his otherwise ceaseless life. The clock ticked softly on the mantel, its rhythmic sound the only company in the room. Poirot, who had spent a lifetime observing the smallest of details, now found himself lost in thought, savoring the tranquility. He was a man who craved order, precision, the methodical perfection of his mind, a far cry from the chaotic world he often found himself drawn into. Miss Lemon, his ever-diligent secretary, entered quietly, her footsteps muffled against the plush carpet. As always, she carried a stack of correspondence, neatly organized and ready for his review. But there was something different about the way she approached him today. Her brow furrowed, her usually perfect composure disturbed. She placed a letter on his desk with an odd hesitation. Poirot's sharp eyes narrowed slightly. "Is something the matter, Miss Lemon?" he asked, his voice smooth, but with a note of concern. She paused before speaking, her lips pressing together for a moment, as though unsure how to frame the words. "Monsieur Poirot, I must admit something unusual. I have made an error." Her voice, typically calm and composed, carried a trace of uncharacteristic nervousness. Poirot raised an eyebrow, his interest piqued. "An error? Impossible, my dear Miss Lemon. Your work is impeccable." She smiled faintly, but the worry lingered in her eyes. "I thought the same, sir, but this is troubling." She handed him the letter with a slight tremor. It was addressed to her sister, who ran a modest student hostel on Hickory Road. At first glance, it appeared to be a routine request for an update on the hostel's affairs. But as Poirot scanned the contents, a curious detail caught his eye, a reference to a series of strange thefts, each more baffling than the last. Miss Lemon leaned in, her voice dropping lower. "It seems someone has been stealing items, sir. Odd items. No rhyme, no reason, just oddities." She glanced around as though someone might overhear, her usual poise shaken. A stethoscope, several light bulbs, flannel trousers, a box of chocolates, a slashed rucksack, boracic powder, and, most strangely of all, a diamond ring found submerged in a bowl of soup. Poirot set the letter down, his fingers lightly tapping on the desk, a reflection of the careful thought he was now processing. The thefts, on their own, seemed trivial, perhaps the acts of bored students or petty mischief. But there was something more in the way Miss Lemon had described them. The assortment was bizarre, yes, but it was the method, the precision of the selection, and the peculiar nature of the objects that caught his attention. "Tell me, Miss Lemon," Poirot said, his voice low and filled with quiet intensity. "How could one explain a diamond ring submerged in soup? And what does one make of such a collection of items? Each, it seems, a piece of a larger puzzle, though the pieces remain disjointed." Miss Lemon hesitated for a moment, her eyes clouded with uncertainty. "I don't know, sir, but my sister is frightened, and I fear she's not the only one." Poirot stood, his small frame seeming to swell with determination. "I shall go, then, to Hickory Road. I shall see for myself. There is more to this mystery than simple theft. I feel it in my bones." As Poirot turned to gather his coat, Miss Lemon watched him with a mixture of admiration and apprehension. She knew well the depths to which Poirot could sink when a case captured his mind. And this was no ordinary case, a string of petty thefts, or was it something far darker? Poirot's eyes met hers, his expression unreadable, but for the slightest flicker of excitement. "Miss Lemon, it is said that the smallest of details often hold the key to the greatest mysteries. And this is a detail that demands our attention." With that, he turned and strode out of the room, his mind already racing through possibilities, each one more tangled than the last. Cliffhanger ending. The moment Poirot arrived at the student hostel on Hickory Road, an eerie stillness enveloped the building. The air was thick with a strange heaviness, as if the very walls whispered secrets. Inside, The once bustling corridors of the hostel were unnervingly silent. Miss Lemon's sister, a pale shadow of her usual self, met Poirot at the door. Her eyes were wide with dread, her voice barely a whisper. "Something is wrong, Monsieur Poirot. We thought the thefts were random, but last night, something happened. Something worse." Poirot's eyes gleamed with determination. "What do you mean, worse, madam?" Before she could answer, the lights flickered, and from somewhere deep within the building, a single, unmistakable sound echoed the faint, eerie toll of a bell that had not rung in years. Poirot froze. This was no ordinary case of theft. He could feel it in the air. The clock was ticking, and something far more sinister awaited him within those walls. The investigation begins. Hercule Poirot arrived at the hostel on Hickory Road, with a mind sharpened by years of experience. But even he could not deny the strange weight that hung in the air. The building stood at the end of a narrow street, a plain, somewhat decrepit structure that seemed to resist the march of time. Its faded red bricks bore the scars of many years, and the windows, though clean, looked out onto the quiet street like watchful eyes. As Poirot made his way up the creaking steps to the front door, the faint toll of a bell reverberated through the building, its echo lingering in the stillness. He adjusted his immaculate suit, straightened his tie, and rang the bell. Moments later, the door opened to reveal Mrs. Hubbard, the hostel's matron. She was a no-nonsense woman with a sharp face and an even sharper tongue. She greeted Poirot with a tight-lipped smile that barely concealed the nervousness behind her eyes. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice clipped, "I do hope you'll find this matter as troubling as I do. We are decent people here, and I cannot understand what would bring such strange behavior into my establishment." Poirot stepped inside, nodding politely. "I am sure you are a woman of great organization, madam, but as you know, the case is far more complicated than it first appears." The hostel's atmosphere was stifling. The small hallways, lined with faded wallpaper and the faint scent of old wood, were filled with students all young, eager, yet curiously tense. Poirot's sharp eyes scanned the room as he was led down a narrow corridor. His attention was caught by the variety of personalities before him. The shy Celia Austin, a slight woman whose face flushed with embarrassment at the mere thought of conversation. The aloof Nigel Chapman, a medical student with a gaze that carried the arrogance of someone who thought themselves beyond reproach. And Colin McNabb, a psychology student who exuded confidence, but whose eyes betrayed a deeper complexity, an emotional layer, buried beneath his calm exterior. The first to speak with Poirot was Celia Austin. She seemed hesitant, her voice quivering slightly as she explained her situation. I've taken things before," she confessed. Her cheeks flushed crimson. "Just little things, a bottle of perfume here, a book there. Nothing to cause any harm, I swear. I thought it might make him notice me." She glanced nervously towards Colin McNabb, who was standing near the door, observing her with a detached air. "But I've never stolen anything important, Monsieur Poirot. Not like what's been happening here." She spoke quickly, almost as if to distance herself from the idea of being associated with the more serious thefts. "And I never did anything to Elizabeth Johnston's artwork. I swear it." Poirot studied her for a moment, his steely eyes watching her every movement. "And the ring submerged in soup. What of that, mademoiselle? Does this mystery not trouble you?" Celia faltered. "I don't know, sir. I haven't heard much about that, but I don't think it's my doing. I could never." Poirot's gaze shifted as he turned his attention to the others. Nigel Chapman, leaning against the wall with an air of quiet self-assurance, now caught his eye. His movements were languid, but Poirot could tell that his mind was anything but relaxed. "Ah, Monsieur Chapman," Poirot greeted, his voice smooth. "You are studying medicine, yes. Quite an interesting field. Perhaps you have a clinical perspective on all this. What do you make of these peculiar thefts?" Nigel's lips curled into a faint, disinterested smile. "Thefts? You mean those petty items? You're asking the wrong person, Poirot. I don't concern myself with trivial matters. People will always find a way to be odd. especially students with too much time on their hands. His voice had a coldness to it that made Poirot pause. It was clear that the young man had a certain detachment, but was it simply indifference, or something more deliberate? Poirot didn't respond immediately. Instead, he allowed a silence to stretch, watching as Nigel seemed increasingly uncomfortable. The young man's eyes darted nervously for a split second before he straightened up, his aloofness slipping just enough to reveal an undercurrent of unease. As Poirot continued his examination, he observed the other residents. There was something unsettling in the air, a tension that stretched the fabric of the hostel, and he could feel it in every glance, every movement. The students were all hiding something: secrets, fears, perhaps even guilt. Then, as Poirot was about to speak with Colin McNab, a sudden sharp noise interrupted the proceedings. A door slammed shut somewhere in the building, followed by muffled voices, a heated argument, it seemed. The tension in the room thickened, and Poirot turned to Mrs. Hubbard with a raised brow. "Ah, madame," he said, his voice laced with curiosity. "I do believe I must investigate that." But before he could finish, the lights flickered once more. A low hum began to emanate from somewhere deep within the hostel, an unsettling, almost mechanical sound. The students exchanged uneasy glances, and even Mrs. Hubbard seemed taken aback. Poirot's gaze sharpened. This was no longer just a case of theft. Something more sinister was afoot, and he knew it. But what was the connection? Was there something or someone pulling the strings from behind the scenes? The room seemed to close in around him as Poirot stood still, absorbing every detail, every flicker of tension, every whispered word. Cliffhanger ending. Just as Poirot was about to make his next move, a sudden, piercing scream echoed through the hallway, a woman's scream, sharp and filled with terror. Everyone froze. Mrs. Hubbard's face turned white. Celia gasped, her eyes wide with shock, and Nigel Chapman's confident mask cracked for a moment, revealing something darker lurking within. Poirot moved swiftly, his mind already racing ahead, piecing together the fragments of the puzzle. He had to act fast. He motioned for Mrs. Hubbard to lead the way, his steps calm but purposeful. They reached the source of the scream, only to find the door to one of the student rooms wide open. Inside, the room was in disarray, papers scattered on the floor, and the window thrown wide open, the cold air rushing in. But it was the center of the room that made Poirot's heart skip a beat. A body, a lifeless form, sprawled across the floor, with an unmistakable item clutched tightly in its hand, a diamond ring. The first murder. The morning light was reluctant to filter through the curtains of Celia Austin's small, modest room at the hostel. The usual sounds of bustling students and the creaking of the building's old bones seemed distant, as if the very air held its breath. It wasn't until Mrs. Hubbard had entered the room to deliver the daily tea that the stillness was broken, a stillness that could only be described as unnatural. At first it seemed like Celia was simply asleep. Her frail form was crumpled beside the bed, a tragic image of a young girl caught in the throes of what appeared to be a fatal overdose. The empty morphine syringe beside her body seemed to confirm this sorrowful conclusion. Mrs. Hubbard, white-faced, hurried to her side, but there was no response. She screamed, a sharp cry that echoed through the hall, summoning the other residents to the scene. Poirot was immediately summoned, his mind already buzzing with 1,000 questions. As he entered the room, the heavy scent of stale air mixed with something faint, something almost imperceptible yet distinctive. His sharp eyes moved over the scene, taking in every detail: the way Celia's body was positioned, the syringe lying discarded by her side, the scattered papers and books across the floor. He bent down, inspecting the syringe with his usual precision, noting the needle's unusual angle, as if it had been hastily discarded. His fingers brushed against the young woman's cold skin, and his gaze moved to the room's other details: the scattered belongings, the bed covers twisted in a hasty manner, the overturned chair near the desk. The scene, while tragic, seemed wrong. Poirot's nose twitched, his mind racing, as he caught the faintest trace of almond bitter, sharp, unmistakable. A scent that to most would be ignored in the midst of the obvious tragedy. But to Poirot, it was a calling card. Cyanide. The very presence of the odor revealed the true nature of the crime. He stood back, his expression unreadable, and surveyed the room once more. Celia's lifeless form lay before him, her delicate features frozen in a state of peace that belied the violence of her death. Her eyes were closed, yet something about the stillness was deeply unsettling. She had not been the victim of a typical overdose. This was far too methodical. Poirot's gaze flicked to the morphine syringe again, now doubting the ease with which the authorities would label this as another tragic case of addiction gone wrong. Poirot's thoughts were interrupted by Mrs. Hubbard's frantic voice. "Monsieur Poirot, what do you think? Could it be an overdose?" Poirot's lips tightened into a thin line, his eyes distant as he stared at the girl's body. "No, madame," he said softly, his voice steady, though a quiet intensity simmered beneath. "This is no overdose. It is something far darker. Someone planned this, someone who knew exactly what they were doing." He took a deep breath, his mind turning over the details as his gaze shifted from Celia's lifeless body to the room's atmosphere. It wasn't simply the cyanide that had caught his attention. There were other things that were more subtle, yet far more telling. The angle of the syringe, the way it had been discarded so carelessly. The position of Celia's body, too, was not one of someone who had simply collapsed after self-administering. No, this was a scene crafted to mislead, to draw attention away from the true cause of death. Poirot's voice grew colder, more resolute as he addressed Mrs. Hubbard once more. "The presence of cyanide, madame, is not a coincidence. Whoever killed this girl knew exactly how to administer the poison, and they intended to make it look like something else entirely." Mrs. Hubbard trembled, her hands clasped tightly together. But why? Why Celia? She was just so shy, so meek. Poirot's gaze softened for a brief moment. "That, my dear lady, is precisely the question. Celia was not the target. She was merely a means to an end. The true motive lies elsewhere. I am certain of it." With a sigh, Poirot stood up, his mind already forming a plan. The case was no longer simply about a series of odd thefts. This was something far more sinister, and Poirot's resolve solidified as he turned on his heel, his coat swirling around him with quiet finality. "We must move quickly, Mrs. Hubbard," Poirot said, his voice laced with a quiet urgency. "The killer is still among us, and they will strike again." As he left the room, the faint, chilling feeling that something darker was lurking beneath the surface of this case gnawed at him. Celia's death was but the first piece in a much larger puzzle, a puzzle that seemed to be slipping further from his grasp with each passing moment. Celia's death was but the first piece in a much larger puzzle, a puzzle that seemed to be slipping further from his grasp with each passing moment. Cliffhanger ending. Just as Poirot reached the door, something caught his attention, a small, delicate piece of paper, half hidden beneath the bed. He bent down to retrieve it, his fingers brushing against the faintly crinkled edge. It was a note, hastily written, the ink smudged in places as though the writer had been rushed. He read the message aloud, his voice quiet but steady. "The truth lies in the shadows. Only the brave will see what's hidden in plain sight." Poirot's heart skipped a beat as he considered the implications of the note. The killer was playing a dangerous game, and they were taunting him. The walls of the hostel suddenly felt closer, tighter. A sense of dread filled the air, and Poirot knew one thing with absolute certainty: whoever was behind these deaths, they were always one step ahead of him. He would need to be vigilant. He would need to trust no one. And he would have to move quickly, before the killer struck again. Uncovering secrets. The hostel was heavy, with the lingering scent of fear, each step Poirot took seeming to echo in the quiet hallways. The once lively atmosphere had now soured, with the residents keeping their distance, eyeing each other with suspicion. It was as though an invisible web had been spun, and everyone was caught in its snare. The deaths, the thefts, and the strange confessions had turned the hostel into a pressure cooker, ready to explode. Poirot's sharp gaze never wavered as he sat across from the first of the suspects, Nigel Chapman. The medical student was lounging in a chair, his usual air of confidence replaced with a certain weariness. His fingers drummed against the armrest, betraying a subtle nervousness that did not go unnoticed by Poirot. "So, Monsieur Chapman," Poirot began, his voice smooth and measured, "you admit to the theft of the stethoscope. A strange item to steal, non?" Nigel's lips curled into a faint smile, though his eyes remained guarded. "A bet, Monsieur Poirot," he said in a low voice, his charm failing to mask the tension underneath. "A foolish wager with some colleagues. They dared me to collect rare poisons, and the stethoscope, well, it was just the last piece of the collection. Nothing sinister, I assure you." Poirot didn't flinch, but his mind was working, swiftly sifting through the details. Nigel's confession was almost too convenient. A bet. Rare poisons. It seemed like the sort of story one might tell to deflect suspicion, but Poirot had learned long ago not to take people at face value. "Rare poisons, you say?" Poirot's brow furrowed slightly as he repeated the words. "And what does one do with such a collection? It is not a mere hobby, surely." Nigel shifted uncomfortably but managed to maintain his calm facade. "I have no interest in harming anyone, Poirot. It's just a fascination, a subject I've studied, that's all." Poirot's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing more. Nigel's demeanor did not reveal the whole truth. It was a confession that had the scent of half-truths, and Poirot was not convinced. But it was the next confession that would truly start to unravel the mystery. Poirot and Inspector Sharp moved next to Valerie Hobhouse, a striking woman who owned the nearby beauty salon. She was poised and impeccably dressed, a picture of grace, but even her beauty could not disguise the shadows that lay beneath her carefully constructed exterior. "What have you, Madame Hobhouse?" Poirot inquired, his tone neutral but firm. "The diamond ring, yes. You stole it, but for what purpose?" Valerie's lips parted, as if she had expected the question. Her eyes darted momentarily to the window, and she bit her lower lip before responding. "It was to pay off a debt," she admitted, her voice low, almost shameful. "A gambling debt, to be precise. I lost far too much to some unsavory men. The ring. It was the only thing of value I had left." Poirot studied her carefully. Her story seemed plausible, but there was an edge to her words, a quiet desperation that felt rehearsed. "Ah, yes, gambling," Poirot murmured, as though mulling over her explanation. "And how much of a debt, may I ask, Madame Hobhouse? Perhaps enough to make you act impulsively." Valerie's eyes flickered nervously, but she quickly regained her composure. "Enough to make me desperate," she answered softly. "I never meant for any of this to happen. I was just trying to survive." Poirot's gaze hardened slightly. "And did you believe the ring would settle your debts? Or was there something more strategic about it?" Valerie's hand trembled, and she reached up to adjust her hair, avoiding his gaze. Poirot's instincts told him that this was another piece of the puzzle, but it was far from the complete picture. He stood up, his mind now fully engaged in the complexity of the case. These confessions, each one a small, carefully crafted story, were nothing but distractions. Pieces that did not fit, that did not add up. These thefts were not mere petty crimes, and the deaths that followed were part of a far greater scheme. Poirot turned to Sharp, his voice calm, yet filled with resolve. "The thefts, you see, are connected not in the way they would have us believe. They are not isolated incidents. No, my friend, they are a warning. Someone is playing a game, and we are merely pawns on their board." As Poirot spoke, a shadow passed over the room, a quiet unease settling in. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to take shape, but they were still scattered, far from the full image. There was something deeper at play here, something sinister. These confessions, these distractions, were simply a smokescreen, hiding the true face of the crime. And just as Poirot turned to leave, his keen eyes caught something that no one else had noticed: a faint smear of ink on the edge of Valerie's sleeve. It was subtle, but it was there, a clue that would lead him to the next startling revelation. Cliffhanger ending. Poirot reached out, his fingers brushing the sleeve of Valerie Hobhouse's dress. She stiffened, and for a moment, the facade of composure cracked. Poirot's eyes gleamed with realization as he tugged the sleeve slightly, revealing the ink stain more clearly. It wasn't just ink. It was blood. A chill ran through the room as the implication hit. This was no simple theft. This was no ordinary crime. Poirot's mind raced, and his next words, spoken in a calm yet unwavering voice, sent a ripple of unease through the room. "Madame Hobhouse, I believe you have been hiding more than a gambling debt." Valerie's face drained of color. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. The truth was much darker than anyone could have imagined, and Poirot had only just begun to uncover it. The walls of the hostel seemed to close in, and the shadows that had once seemed so distant now felt all too real. The second murder. The atmosphere inside the hostel had grown heavier, each room now a secret waiting to be uncovered. The residents had begun to avoid each other, their whispers growing louder with every step. There was no escaping the undercurrent of dread that gripped the walls. It was as if the very air had turned thick, with tension thick enough to strangle anyone who dared to get too close to the truth. Poirot, however, remained calm, his mind working tirelessly, piecing together the delicate threads of a complex web. But even his razor-sharp mind couldn't have prepared him for what came next. The body of Mrs. Nicolaitis, the anxious and jittery co-owner of the hostel, was found sprawled out in her room. Her usually neat and proper appearance was marred by the unnatural angle of her head and the stillness of her form. A glass of brandy lay on the floor, its contents having spilled across the wooden surface, now mingling with the growing pool of dark blood beneath her. Her fingers, though cold and stiff, still clutched the empty glass tightly, as if it were her final act, a desperate grip on the last thing she thought could bring comfort. Poirot's gaze swept the room methodically. The scene was carefully arranged, as though someone had staged it to look like a drunken accident. But to Poirot the signs were all too clear. There was something deliberate in the way the poison had been administered, too controlled, too calculated to be the act of someone in a frantic rage. Mrs. Nicolaitis had been silenced. He bent down, his eyes narrowing as he inspected the brandy. The subtle scent of almonds lingered in the air, unmistakable cyanide. But not just any cyanide. The poison had been crafted in a way that could only have been done by someone with knowledge of chemistry. Someone who understood how to create a slow-acting, undetectable poison, one that would go unnoticed until it was far too late. Poirot's thoughts raced. Who could have had access to such knowledge? Who could have been so meticulous in their planning? Mrs. Nicolaitis's face was pale, her expression frozen in a grimace of agony. Yet, there was something even more chilling than her death. It was the rucksack lying beside the bed, an odd, old-fashioned thing with a weathered look. Its base was marked with strange indentations, almost as if it had been used for something far heavier than carrying clothes. Poirot bent down to examine it, his fingers brushing the surface. "Smuggling," Poirot muttered under his breath, his mind connecting the dots. The indentations, the unusual weight, the need for secrecy. It all pointed to a much larger operation, one far more dangerous than a petty theft or an isolated murder. Mrs. Nicolaitis had not been just a nervous woman running a hostel. No, she had been a cog in a far more dangerous machine. An international smuggling ring, hidden in plain sight, had used the hostel as a cover for their illicit operations. The drugs, the rare poisons, the counterfeit goods, it all made sense now. She had been the link between the underworld and the unsuspecting public, and someone had decided that she was too dangerous to live. Poirot stood slowly, his thoughts swirling. This was no crime of passion. This was a calculated act of silencing a dangerous person who knew too much. The stakes were rising. Whoever was behind these deaths was not only clever but ruthless. Poirot turned to Inspector Sharp, his expression darkening. "This is no random killing. No, Sharp. This is part of something much bigger. Mrs. Nicolaitis knew something. Something that someone was willing to kill for." The realization struck Poirot like a bolt of lightning. The hostel, the deaths, the thefts, the strange behavior of the residents, it was all connected. But to what end? What were they really hiding? Sharp looked troubled. But Poirot, what is the connection? Who benefits from silencing a woman like her? Poirot's gaze remained fixed on the rucksack, his eyes narrowing. There was more to uncover, but the pieces of the puzzle were coming together in a way that made his blood run cold. Cliffhanger ending. Poirot stood in silence, his mind racing, as his eyes locked onto the rucksack once more. He needed to know what was inside, what secrets it held. "Sharp," Poirot said suddenly, his voice low and urgent. "We must open this bag, now." With trembling hands, Sharp unzipped the rucksack, revealing its contents. But just as he pulled out the first item, a small, carefully wrapped package, a sharp sound echoed through the hostel. A door slammed open, and a figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the dim hallway light. Poirot's heart skipped a beat. It was one of them. The figure stepped forward, but Poirot didn't need to see their face to know that something had just shifted. The game had escalated, and this time, Poirot was no longer certain who the hunter was, and who was the hunted. "Not so fast, Poirot," the voice called out, filled with cold menace. "You're digging in places where you don't belong." The bag dropped from Poirot's hands. The stakes had just gotten impossibly higher. Someone in the hostel was willing to kill to protect their secrets, and Poirot had just gotten too close. Cliffhanger ending. Poirot stood in silence, his mind racing, as his eyes locked onto the rucksack once more. He needed to know what was inside, what secrets it held. "Sharp," Poirot said suddenly, his voice low and urgent. "We must open this bag, now." With trembling hands, Sharp unzipped the rucksack, revealing its contents. But just as he pulled out the first item, a small, carefully wrapped package, a sharp sound echoed through the hostel. A door slammed open, and a figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the dim hallway light. Poirot's heart skipped a beat. It was one of them. The figure stepped forward, but Poirot didn't need to see their face to know that something had just shifted. The game had escalated, and this time, Poirot was no longer certain who the hunter was, and who was the hunted. "Not so fast, Poirot," the voice called out, filled with cold menace. "You're digging in places where you don't belong." The bag dropped from Poirot's hands. The stakes had just gotten impossibly higher. Someone in the hostel was willing to kill to protect their secrets, and Poirot had just gotten too close. The web tightens. The atmosphere in the hostel had shifted from tense to suffocating. The death of Mrs. Nicoletis had left the residents trembling, their once innocent faces now etched with suspicion. Every conversation, every gesture felt loaded with something unspoken, something that threatened to come crashing down at any moment. And then, amidst the unease, the whispers started again. Patricia Lane was a woman of sharp intelligence, known for her quick mind and subtle observations. She had a quiet confidence about her, an air of someone who knew just a little bit more than everyone else, and she was determined to uncover the truth. She'd spent days quietly watching the residents, connecting the dots between the strange behavior, the thefts, the missing items, and the whispered rumors that seemed to circle around Nigel Chapman. It was during one of her surreptitious visits to his room that Patricia had made a discovery: bicarbonate of soda, a seemingly harmless, innocuous substance to most, but Patricia knew better. In the context of the strange deaths, it had a much darker meaning. The bicarbonate had been used to replace the morphine in Nigel's possession, a clever way to fool those who might have been keeping an eye on him. But Patricia's curiosity drove her to dig deeper. The more she investigated, the more unsettling things became. Her fingers trembled as she uncovered the true horror of what Nigel had hidden. The bicarbonate wasn't just bicarbonate, it had been replaced. In its place, Patricia found a white powder, boracic powder, commonly used for its antiseptic properties. But it was also a deadly poison when ingested in large quantities, a substance capable of causing slow, agonizing death. Her heart pounded as the realization set in. Nigel wasn't just a student dabbling in dangerous substances. He was someone far more sinister. He wasn't just stealing for a game or for bets. He was complicit in a web of lies, deceit, and murder. Patricia's mind raced with the implications. The thefts were no longer simple misdeeds. They were pieces of a far larger puzzle. And Patricia, with her sharp eye, had seen enough to know that the only way forward was to confront Nigel. She had to expose him, make him face the truth, but she couldn't do it alone. She needed Poirot. She needed someone who could untangle the web she had begun to see so clearly. But before she could act, the unthinkable happened. The hostel was eerily quiet that evening, the kind of quiet that made the shadows feel alive, creeping along the walls. Patricia, her mind spinning with thoughts of what to do next, had made her way to the common room, where she was going over her notes. The others were either too nervous or too distracted by their own secrets to notice her. As she passed the corridor leading to the back rooms, a muffled sound caught her attention, a dull thud, followed by the faintest whimper. Her blood ran cold. She knew immediately something was terribly wrong. Patricia rushed toward the sound, her heart pounding in her chest. She reached the door to her own room and threw it open, only to stop dead in her tracks. The sight that greeted her was too much to bear. There, on the floor, her body contorted at unnatural angles, lay Patricia herself. The room was awash in a spray of blood. Her face, once composed and intelligent, was now twisted in a grotesque expression of agony. A bludgeoning weapon lay beside her lifeless form, a cruel instrument with traces of her own blood still splattered across its surface. Poirot arrived at the scene moments later, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the chaos around him. His eyes swept the room, but his face betrayed no emotion, save for the tiniest flicker of something darker. He kneeled beside Patricia's body, the realization sinking in with every passing second. The sheer brutality of the crime shook Poirot to his core. The method was savage, unrestrained, a marked departure from the more calculated murders that had preceded it. This wasn't just about silencing someone. This was a message. Someone wanted to make sure Patricia's discovery was buried, to ensure that no one else would dare to uncover the truth. Poirot stood slowly, his expression grim as he took in the grisly scene. The tension in the hostel had reached a boiling point. The thefts, the smuggling, the murders, it was all leading to one inevitable conclusion. The killer was someone who knew exactly what they were doing, someone who had studied the art of murder as one might study a craft. Someone who was playing a game, but whose game was far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. Poirot's thoughts whirred as he pieced the new information together. The network of deceit was expanding, drawing in every resident, every action. The hostel was a hub of secrets, and the killer was orchestrating their every move with a chilling precision. And now, with Patricia gone, the stakes had never been higher. Cliffhanger ending. Just as Poirot was about to turn away from the body, his gaze fell upon something he hadn't noticed before. A single sheet of paper, hastily scribbled, lying in Patricia's trembling hand. He moved swiftly, carefully prying the paper free, and read the cryptic message written there. "The web is tighter than you think. Someone is closer than you realize." Poirot's face remained unreadable, but inside, his mind raced. The killer was watching. They were aware of everything. Patricia's message was no accident. It was a warning, a final clue. A sudden sound from behind him made Poirot stiffen. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He turned quickly, his eyes scanning the shadows, but there was no one there. The game was shifting, and Poirot knew that he was now a target. The shocking truth, climax. The common room of the hostel was thick with tension. Every remaining resident gathered in anxious silence, their eyes flicking between one another, each person trying to mask their own fear. Poirot stood at the head of the room, his posture straight, his expression as inscrutable as ever. But beneath the surface, his mind was like a finely tuned instrument. Every detail, every conversation, every misstep had led him here, to this moment of revelation. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the faces of the residents. The room felt smaller now, suffocating, as if the very walls were closing in. The final pieces of the puzzle had clicked together in Poirot's mind, and now, with careful deliberation, he was about to unveil the shocking truth. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot began, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable weight. "I have gathered you here this evening not merely to share my findings, but to deliver what I know to be the truth. The truth about a murderer who has been hiding in plain sight, manipulating you all as a spider spins its web." His gaze swept over the faces of those who remained. Valerie Hobhouse's beauty no longer seemed to matter, her perfectly made-up face now betraying a flicker of guilt. Nigel Chapman shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting from one corner of the room to the other, but he said nothing. Mrs. Nicolaitis's absence was palpable, her ghost still lingering in the air like a heavy, unspoken presence. And then there was Patricia, her absence now a raw wound, a stark reminder of the dangers that had lurked among them. Poirot paused for a moment, allowing the suspense to thicken, before he continued. His eyes locked onto Nigel, whose nervousness was now almost palpable. "It was Nigel Chapman," Poirot said, his words falling like a thunderclap in the tense silence. A gasp swept through the room, but Poirot's eyes never wavered from Nigel. Nigel's pale face flushed as he opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Poirot pressed on, his voice steady, but there was a sharpness to it now, a razor-like edge that cut through the room. "Nigel Chapman," Poirot repeated, his tone hardening. "You killed Celia because she had discovered your darkest secret. You were no mere student. You were a key player in an international smuggling ring, and Celia, with her innocent curiosity, had uncovered the truth. Her flirtations, her need to know more, made her a threat to you. And so you silenced her, poisoning her with that subtle, deadly concoction." Nigel's lips trembled, his face contorted with something between fury and fear. "You're wrong," he whispered hoarsely, but the guilt in his eyes betrayed him. Poirot turned toward the others. "But Celia was only the beginning. Mrs. Nicolaitis, too, knew too much. She was connected to the operation, and she had been trying to protect you, trying to shield your mother from the truth. When she realized she was at risk, she planned to expose you, but you couldn't allow that to happen. You eliminated her with poisoned brandy, knowing she had become a liability." The room was silent, every eye fixed on Poirot, every face pale. Valerie's hands clenched into fists, her eyes wide, her lips trembling. "Patricia Lane," Poirot continued, his gaze moving to the woman who had once been so sharp, so keen. "She was another victim of your secret. She stumbled upon your deception and the way you had replaced the morphine with boracic powder. She was about to expose you, but you could not afford to let that happen. You knew that she was getting too close to the truth, and so you took her life in a brutal manner to ensure she would never speak again." Valerie Hobhouse's breath caught in her throat. "You're lying," she whispered, but there was no conviction in her voice. The facade was crumbling. Poirot's gaze sharpened. "You've been protecting him, haven't you?" Poirot asked, his eyes now locked onto Valerie with unrelenting focus. "You knew what he was capable of, and yet you tried to protect him. But you could not protect him forever, could you, Valerie?" Her face paled as the truth dawned. "What are you talking about?" she stammered, but the faintest tremor in her voice betrayed her. Poirot smiled softly, a grim twist of irony in his expression. "You've been trying to protect him from exposure, haven't you? All these lies, these efforts to cover his tracks, it was all for him. But what you failed to realize, Valerie, is that he's been manipulating you all along." There was a silence, and then the truth broke like a storm. "Mrs. Nicolaitis was your mother, wasn't she?" Poirot asked, his voice calm but the implication hanging heavy in the air. "And it was your mother who tried to protect you from Nigel's deadly ambitions. But in the end, she paid the price for her loyalty. She knew the extent of his crimes, and she was willing to sacrifice herself to save you from the man you've been protecting all this time." Valerie's face drained of color. Her breath hitched, and for a moment she appeared on the verge of collapse. She stumbled backward, her eyes wide, a wave of guilt and horror washing over her, as Poirot's words sunk in. "No, no, it can't be." "But it is," Poirot said, his voice unwavering. "And it all started with a jealous, dangerous man who poisoned his own mother, your mother, Valerie. In a fit of rage, he killed her, and then he buried the truth, all the while pulling the strings from behind the scenes." The room was still. No one dared to speak, the weight of Poirot's revelations settling like a heavy shroud over them all. Valerie's eyes filled with tears, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of betrayal, of having been a pawn in a deadly game she hadn't even realized she was playing. Nigel finally spoke, his voice trembling. "You don't understand. You don't know what it's like. You didn't see what she—" His words were cut off by Poirot's stern, cutting voice. "I understand more than you think, Monsieur Chapman. The truth always finds its way to the surface, no matter how deep it's buried." Cliffhanger ending. As Poirot took a step toward Nigel, the door to the common room suddenly creaked open, sending a cold gust of wind into the room. A shadow moved across the threshold, and the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the silence. Everyone turned in unison, their breath catching in their throats, as a figure emerged from the darkness of the hallway, a figure none of them had expected to see. Poirot's eyes widened in disbelief as the figure stepped into the light. It was Mrs. Nicolaitis, alive. The room was frozen in shock, the world around them spinning with confusion. Mrs. Nicolaitis had been dead, her murder meticulously covered up, but here she stood, her eyes steely, her presence commanding. The killer was still among them, and this time they were closer than ever. The killer was still among them, and this time they were closer than ever.